everyone, my name is Rachel Mauchline, and I serve as one of the staff writers for Champion Briefs. I also am the Assistant Director of Speech and Debate for Durham Academy, and this is the 2025 NSDA Nationals, or June 2025, topic analysis video. If you're watching this video and you're attending NSDA Nationals, congratulations and good luck. And this topic analysis will provide a brief overview of the topic that will be debated by hundreds of students this summer. That topic is resolved on balance in the United States. The benefits of presidential executive orders outweigh the harms. Transparently, I'm super glad this is the topic that's being debated. I think it's one that individuals might have some notion of what an executive order is, and it allows students to have a more greater understanding. I think especially with the civics components that come with this topic, it will allow for some great debates. This topic analysis always serves as an overview, and I would highly encourage individuals who are competing to check out the Champion Briefs brief for the month of June. That contains topic analysis, arguments, and blocks to key and critical responses that you would need for this topic. If you are debating, I would encourage students to also keep in mind that while it is a busy time of year with graduations, end of year projects, exams, that it's important to set the goals for what you want to achieve at nationals based on the work you're able and willing to put in. And this topic analysis and watching this is a great starting point, but it is a starting point to future research and future case creation, argument development, etc. This topic analysis is going to be structured, as many are, by first talking about the strategic considerations that teams should keep in mind with the topic, then looking at the pro side of the debate, and finally looking at the con side of the debate. So delving into the strategic considerations, when individuals think about executive orders, they probably have some notion of what one is based on watching the news or reading a newspaper, but it's important to keep in mind that both teams need to clearly articulate in their argumentation, their definitions, their examples, what is an executive order, and provide strong examples for that. While this is a topic that is being debated in 2025, it is not one that should be viewed in a vacuum. So I would definitely encourage teams that as we're talking today and looking towards June, that they are articulating examples of executive orders, not just from the current administration in a vacuum, but holistically throughout the history of executive orders within the United States. It's important, first of all, to do two things: define the key words in the topic, and then look at overarching historical context. When it comes to this specific topic and the choosing and the wording that has been presented, the first thing to define is on balance. On balance is the first phrase in the resolution. It's a phrase that is often in public forum topics. It means that we should look at the topic on a set of scales. When you look at the topic and when you look at what happens in the debate, you should view it like a set of scales. If at the end of the debate you believe the pro team has been more compelling and they have proved to you how in this specific instance the benefits outweigh the harms, then you should vote pro. If you at the end of the debate think the harms outweigh the benefits, then you should vote con. That is the nuance of what on balance means. And that a description of it with the set of scales is something that can be a really compelling strategy to use to have ballot-inducive language, especially because you're going to have judges from all across the country and world adjudicating these debates. So keeping in mind, what can on balance mean? The second term to define is that of executive orders. As I said, people think they know what it means, but what does it definitionally mean? The American Bar Association has a really great definition, which is defined as exactly that executive order is a signed, written, and published directive from the President of the United States that manages operations of the federal government. This came from a really quick Google search and definitely aids to both sides on the topic, but making sure you have an example of what this definition is and how does it matriculate into society. There is also a lot of executive order, historical tools. Executive orders, fun fact, have been used since 1789 and have been used since George Washington. So there are plenty of examples that you can look into for the history when it comes to executive orders. There is, in fact, a registry from the National Archives, the Office of Federal Register, that keeps a maintenance of all of the executive orders. Now, of course, if you did a Google search and said, President Trump's first days in office executive orders, you would get a running list from this administration, but this provides some historical context that I definitely think teams could use to their advantage. Another component beyond the definitions in the history to strategically consider are the examples that are getting used. PBS has a really great analysis about like how do executive orders like play into like the civic process. I definitely recommend watching it. It came from a quick Google search. It's something I watched when creating this, but it highlights the need that teams need to consider what landmark or historical examples will be kind of the lynch points of the like, or the catalyst per se, of their side's argumentation. I think pro teams are going to focus on historically positive executive orders. A great example of this is Executive Order 9981, which was from President Harry Truman, which halted racial segregation in the United States military. On the con side, they're going to focus on executive orders that are negative because of things like overreach. And I think, and this leads to an important point, thinking about both sides of the political aisle. Again, you're going to have adjudicators from everywhere who have differing political beliefs. So not just like having examples that lean one side or the other, but having a variety. So an example when it comes to overreach could be, while President Trump probably had some overreach when it came to his national emergency declaration to use military funds on border security, that's probably some overreach. President Biden had the exact same thing when he attempted to forgive all federal student loans. So it's a question of the negative side is going to use examples that are going to talk more about overreach or like the harms of executive orders holistically. But I definitely think that both teams have the ability to make some really clear narratives by using history, which means that you're going to have to be both knowledgeable of current administrations and more recent administrations, but also historically. How have executive orders changed from their formation in 1789 all the way until now in 2025? And that's why the on balance wording is really important for this topic. The first kind of argument when we talk about the pro side of this topic is, as I said, the pro is going to be looking at the benefits throughout history and the examination of those benefits. I think the first argument is that executive orders are a rapid tool to prevent gridlock in politics. You, in many forms of debate, have probably heard about politics disads and political gridlock, and that matriculates in lots of different styles of debate. But the simple fact is that often policies get trapped in the political system based on partisan divisions, such as with immigration, climate, gun control. And presidents have utilized executive orders as an opportunity to get policies to happen when other avenues won't work. A great example of this is the DACA executive order from President Obama, which was regarding undocumented immigrants because there had been no action on immigration by Congress because it was in a deadlock heat. I think the impact of this could be based on the specific executive order, but also could be the idea about like, what is the purpose of political figures? What is the purpose of political systems? And what does that inaction mean for constituents? When there is a lack of action on X area, X executive order is the only way that anything can happen. And I think like teams could definitely, I would recommend maybe some subpoint or some internal substructure that allows some good organization on fleshing out those impacts, but also articulating what that means. I think the second team is going to be about like the role that executive orders probably have when there is like an urgent crisis or something that needs to happen. Executive orders handle natural disasters, terrorism, or things that arise really quickly and don't have the time to go through lengthy political process. So an example here will be President Bush creating the Office of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11, or how President Biden had a rapid response regarding masks and vaccine distribution during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think there's lots of ways that the pro team can talk about how specific impacts would have absolutely had a much greater spillover or scope, magnitude even, if the executive order hadn't have happened. What would the casualties have been? What would the consequence have been? I would encourage teams to not go too butterfly effect on that though and be like, oh, well, here's what could have happened. Absolutely. But have statistics and have analysis from literature to back that up. Turning to the negative side, I think the con team will need to talk about how executive orders have impacted others. There are lots of examples about how executive orders, or specifically a bypass of checks and balances, I think that's probably one of the most stock arguments here, is that executive orders give the ability for the President of the United States to bypass the legislative branch, and it concentrates the power into a single individual. I think there's a really good constitutional argument here about the slippery slope this creates. If one president has overreach, it creates a precedent for future administrations. And also, I think that this leads to some type of a warranting that is executive orders sure do bypass gridlock, but what are the alternatives to that? Are the ways instead, rather than giving one person concentrated power, that we could fix the system from this internal gridlock that leads to a lack of policies? But again, having specific examples of executive order overreach, like what I talked about previously in the strategic considerations. Another argument, I think, would be the notion about reversibility of executive orders. Executive orders, sure, on face value, they check the box, they do the action, but they're so easy to get reversed. And oftentimes, a number of the early executive orders in an administration are reversing or countering the actions of the previous administration. In fact, The Guardian wrote a really interesting article about this current administration with President Trump and how in his first 100 days in office, he signed 141 executive orders. And some of those directly addressing or directly responding to things that happen in the President Biden's administration. I think this is an interesting impact because pending the issue, it leads to a weakened U.S. stance on specific issues. So a great example could be climate change and how policies consistently have been flipped, such as the Paris Climate Accord with President Obama to President Trump to President Biden back to President Trump. And what does that mean for U.S. leadership on issues such as climate? Does that mean that the harms outweigh because it weakens our stance when we're so inconsistent? And it's really declarative from the president. Rather than the notion of a veto on a piece of legislation, what would that symbolically mean for a difference? Overall, this topic has many different nuances. That's just 2 pro and 2 con arguments. But honestly, a quick Google search, a quick examination of previous executive orders certainly leaves teams in a position to actually have some really great debates. I would encourage teams to do the research on those executive orders and to also consider how you're going to be debating, most likely, unless you have a coin flip situation, you'll probably debate both sides of the topic throughout the entire national tournament. And keeping in mind, having different variations of arguments, having different updates to arguments as the tournament goes on, you in fact might have executive orders that occur during the national tournament. And what does that mean for the positions or the stances that you're taking on specific issues? Beyond that, I wish you all the best of luck, especially as we end the 2024-2025 competitive season. And I hope to see you all in Des Moines, Iowa this summer. Good luck.